The frame drum may be the oldest instrument in common use today, its origins stretching deep into prehistory, and its rhythms the music of the Stone Age. Frame drums have been used at some time by the majority of people and places in the world. From samurai in Japan to the shaman of the Sami people in the Arctic Circle. From Roman street musicians to farmhands in rural England. From American Indian medicine men to ancient Greek priestesses. From medieval European courts to ancient Egyptian gods. The frame drum is the simplest of all instruments. A wooden hoop with an animal skin stretched across. The types of skin used varied around the world due to availability. In Europe, sheep or goat skin was common. In Egypt, crocodile skin. And India, snake skin. Today, plastic drum heads have become very popular. To be classed a frame drum, a drum must have a single skin and its width wider than its depth. Sizes vary greatly. Indian kanjira can be as small as 6 inches in diameter, while yakaga drums from Siberia can reach over 50 inches. In some traditions, sticks are used to play them, in others, hands. They can have additions such as snares, jingles or rings added to them, and also be decorated or painted. Frame drum is a generic term. In each language, frame drums have their own names. In North Africa, they are benda or tar. To the Inuit, they are kilaut. In Persia, they are daf, and in Italy, tamora. In Indonesia, they are called ribana. In England, riddle drums. The Chinese say bangu, and the Ghanaians tamalin. Because the origins of the frame drum lie so deep in prehistory, no one is really sure about them. But in this video, I will try and investigate a bit. In many countries, it's traditionally believed that the frame drum is linked with agriculture, and this has led to the main theory of their origin, that they were developed from an agricultural tool which was used as part of the harvesting process. The oldest known frame drum found is painted on a mural on the walls of the Neolithic proto-city of Katuk-Hayuk around 8,500 years ago, at the very dawn of agriculture, which adds weight to the claim of the agricultural link with the drum. Katuk-Hayuk is located in southern Turkey and existed between 9,500 and 7,700 years ago, and was in its day the largest human settlement in the world. At its height, the population was around 10,000 people. What allowed this many people to live in a permanent settlement when just a few millennia ago their hunter-gatherer ancestors would have struggled to provide for a few hundred people was agriculture. The earliest evidence of limited human cultivation of plants dates back to around 12,000 years ago, with the planting of fig trees, but it wasn't until about 9,500 years ago that farming really began in earnest, with the planting of multiple crops and grains. Over the following millennia, increasingly organized and larger scale agriculture was to spread across the Fertile Crescent. One of the most remarkable things is that the agricultural process changed very little from what it began as 9 millennia ago, right up until the 20th century, before the mechanization of farming began. At harvest time, young men and women would make their way to the fields and harvest the grain. Meanwhile, the aged and children would lay the harvested grains across a field and thresh them. Threshing was done using a threshing sled, a flat wooden sled with razor-sharp flint blades underneath, which were weighted down by people standing on it. After many hours of running over the grains in this sled, the grains would have been eviscerated by the flint blades. After threshing, the next stage of the process was called riddling. The eviscerated grains would be gathered up and sieved to separate the unwanted stems and dirt from the corns. The sieves used to do this were called riddle sieves. Riddle sieves were manufactured by bending a piece of wood into a hoop and stretching an animal skin across it. Holes would then be burnt in the skin to produce a sieve. The sieve origin theory argues that early Middle Eastern farmers would have discovered their riddle sieves made excellent percussion instruments, and the frame drum was born. There is very little evidence to support this claim other than tradition and circumstance. However, written evidence supporting this view can be found in England. Folk researcher Peter Kennedy set out to interview, record and preserve the folk music traditions of England in the early to mid-20th century. In southern England he encountered several riddle drummers. His 1936 recording of riddle drummer Alfie Tuck playing is one of the oldest sound recordings of a frame drum in existence. Another riddle drummer, Andrew Curtis, a former agricultural worker, was also interviewed by Kennedy. During the 1950s, he was now 81 years old. Kennedy wrote, "Like many others, Andrew had his own riddle drum, a calf skin, over a large farm sieve, which was used to accompany local melodeon players. It was beaten with a double-ended stick, particularly during step dancing." So Kennedy had not only found a tradition of frame drumming among agricultural workers, He's also noted that they made the association that these drums were both drums and sieves. Kennedy's recordings, photographs and interviews show a strong tradition of agricultural sieve drumming in southern England during the early 20th century. How far before that it goes back is unknown. So in the agricultural sieve model, frame drums would have developed in the Fertile Crescent from agricultural sieves and would have spread from there, arriving in Europe with the Neolithic farmers around 6,000 years ago, and this tradition of agricultural sieve drumming would have continued right up until 1950s England, a 6,000-year-long unbroken tradition in Europe and a 9,000-year-old tradition in the Middle East. Before I go on, it is worth pointing out complex hunter-gathering, a phenomena that occurs all over the world, where hunter-gatherers, instead of living in small mobile groups, live in permanent or semi-permanent villages of between 100 and 2,000 people. In the Fertile Crescent, complex hunter-gathering was to appear in several places as a transitory stage between hunter-gathering and agriculture. Some of the earliest agricultural villages had in fact been established and lived in for 1,000 years before agriculture began. This was because in some parts of the region crops grew naturally in such abundance that it could support permanent settlements. The people in the settlements then began to live a life almost identical to agricultural communities, harvesting, threshing and sieving grain, then storing it in granaries. The only difference was they never sowed the grain because it grew naturally in such abundance. It could be argued then that if sieve origin theory is true, these complex hunter-gatherers, not the first farmers, should be credited with its invention. However, this is a slight change and makes little difference to the origin theory overall. The theory is problematic in the fact it doesn't account for how the numerous hunter-gatherer peoples that never developed agriculture, such as the hunter-gatherer tribes in North America, the Eskimo, the Sami, and many peoples in Russia, not only had frame drums, but placed them of such central importance to their culture. If sieve theory is true, these people must have learnt to make them through some kind of trade or contact with agricultural societies, but at the same time not got other major pieces of culture from the same source, which doesn't really make much sense. So I have been trying to find an alternative theory to the sieve theory for a few years now, and I'm going to present one. In his book of 1829, 4 Years in Southern Africa, Cowper Rose, an officer in the Royal Engineers, described witnessing a Zulu ceremony. He describes 5 women who sat in a circle holding large warrior shields. They were chanting and drumming on these shields. Drumming on shields is an interesting idea. It would be worth looking at how these shields were constructed. Southern African shields were made by making a wooden frame and stretching an animal hide across it. So in essence, a frame drum This kind of makes drumming a shield the same as drumming a frame drum. On this theme, another book, The Races of South Africa, written by ethnologist George William Snow, makes the observation: while drums are common among settled African communities, the nomadic hunter-gatherer bushmen across southern Africa don't use them. Instead, they use their shields as drums. A third author, Percival Kirby, in his book Musical Instruments of the Native Races of South Africa, said shield drumming was not restricted to the Bushmen, but common among the Zulu too. Finally, in her book of 1909, Bushman Painting, ethnologist Helen Tongue discovered 2 rock paintings of hunter-gatherers drumming on their shields. It seems shield drumming is a little known but common practice among South Africans. Unlike with a frame drum, shield hides tended to be thick and hard, so not ideal for drumming. However, this is true with riddle sieves too, which were made of thick leather, had holes in, and suffered from the heavy wear and tear of the agricultural process. So would have made poor drums. Riddle sieves were also common in Ireland, though in western parts of Ireland they were known as borain. In her book Ireland, Its Scenery and Its Culture by Mrs. Halls, published in 1880, she gave a great example of the daily wear and tear on a Western Irish riddle sieve. She writes, the borain is formed of a scraped sheepskin drawn around a hoop and is used instead of a sieve for winnowing corn, filling sacks with grain, holding wool when carded and ready for spinning, or feathers plucked 3 times a year from an unfortunate gander and his wives, and sometimes as a lordly dish, though inexpensive in workmanship, or to hold potatoes, which constitute the family fare. Riddle sieves are found from France to India and just about everywhere in between. It isn't surprising, though, that they're all in such poor condition when one reads how they were treated in Ireland. Working sieves were not suitable for drumming, so a revised drum version was created with thinner skins, no holes, and well kept. Similar could be true of hunter-gatherer shields. They could have had different shields for drumming and for fighting with. So the African evidence seems to suggest the possibility of people around the world, such as hunter-gatherer Indians, Siberian people, who never developed agriculture, could have developed the frame drum from shields. It's also worth noting, painting of frame drums tended not to be common among agricultural using societies, while common among hunter-gatherers. And this frame drum art is virtually identical to the shield art they used. If this theory is true, though, the ramifications are great, as it could make the frame drum much older than agriculture. And even agricultural people could have had them in their hunter-gatherer past, and there have been no development from sieves. No one really knows how the frame drum was created or how old it is, and it might be a lot older than people imagine. But whatever age it is the sound of the Stone Age, whether Neolithic or Paleolithic. When playing or listening to it, you are hearing, feeling and sensing what our ancestors deep in prehistory experienced. There is no other musical instrument that can give you this experience. And those Stone Age rhythms go quite well with modern music too.